The jungle was quiet, the air thick with tension, and the men huddled around their radio, waiting for orders that never came. Then, out of the static, a faint voice broke through. At first, they thought it was just interference, maybe another unit lost in the storm. But as the transmission grew clearer, their blood ran cold. The voice was calling their names, one by one. It was the voice of their sergeant, the same man they'd buried 3 days earlier after an ambush gone wrong. When the radio kept speaking, describing things only the dead could know, they realized the truth. The signal wasn't coming from headquarters. It was coming from somewhere far darker. The jungle had gone eerily silent that night. No wind, no crickets, not even the distant rumble of artillery that usually reminded the men they weren't alone in this godforsaken war. The humidity clung to their skin like a curse, and the fog that rolled in through the trees swallowed their flashlights whole. Sergeant Danner ordered the squad to dig in and wait for contact, but everyone could feel it. Something wasn't right in that stillness. The radio operator, Private Hensley, sat cross-legged beside the transmitter, tapping the dials like a nervous tick. He had done this hundreds of times before, checking frequencies, adjusting static. But tonight the air felt heavier, the equipment colder. The radio's antenna stretched up like a skeleton's finger into the mist, and every flicker of static made the soldiers flinch. They were deep behind enemy lines, days from any reinforcement, surrounded by miles of jungle that even maps didn't bother naming. The sound came at 2:13 a.m. A single burst of white noise, followed by a low hum. Hensley froze, his hand hovering over the receiver. The others turned, rifles ready, as if the static itself could attack them. "Command?" he whispered, but there was no answer. Then the hum grew louder, pulsating in a strange rhythm, almost like breathing. Every man in the camp felt it, not in their ears, but deep in their chests, as if the jungle itself was exhaling. When the voice finally spoke, it was faint, broken by static and distortion. "Anyone, copy, this is Bravo." Hensley's eyes went wide. The voice was familiar but impossible. It sounded exactly like Sergeant Mason, the leader of Bravo Company, the same unit they'd found wiped out 2 weeks earlier. Hensley adjusted the dial with trembling fingers. "Bravo, say again, Bravo, come in." But what came next wasn't protocol. The voice said his name. "Hensley, get out, they're coming." The words dragged through the static like nails on metal. The squad stared at the radio in disbelief. Mason's voice, dead for days, was now warning them. Sergeant Danner grabbed the mic and barked, "Who is this? Identify yourself." The reply came slow, like it had traveled from a long way off, or maybe from somewhere that wasn't supposed to exist. "You shouldn't be here." Then the frequency died in a shriek of static so loud it made their ears bleed. For a moment, no one moved. The fog thickened until the trees were shadows of themselves, and the campfire flickered like it wanted to escape. Hensley sat frozen, his headset still on, staring into the darkness as if he could see the voice. One of the younger privates muttered a prayer under his breath, and Danner ordered everyone to check the perimeter. But the jungle wasn't responding like it used to. No echoes, no wind, just a deep, swallowing silence that pressed on their minds. As the hours dragged on, the radio stayed dead, no signal, no static. The men took turns, dozing with their rifles across their laps, but sleep didn't come easy. Every few minutes, they swore they heard whispers, faint, distant, echoing from the trees. Hensley tried to convince himself it was just wind through the leaves, but there was no wind. And every time the whisper came, it sounded like his name again. By dawn, the fog hadn't lifted. The jungle felt wrong, too still, too heavy. When Danner tried to call headquarters for a position check, the radio came back to life on its own. This time the voice was clearer, stronger, and without static. "Do not move. Stay where you are." But the voice wasn't Mason's anymore. It was Danner's. Every man heard it and turned slowly toward their sergeant, who stood pale and speechless. The radio repeated the message, identical down to the breath. Danner ripped the cable from the transmitter, but the voice kept going. The radio wasn't even powered. It shouldn't have been possible. The sound echoed from the metal shell of the unit, like the voice was trapped inside it. "Stay where you are." Then the tone dropped an octave, and something began tapping on the outside of the tent, slow, deliberate, like fingers on canvas. Hensley unholstered his pistol and crawled toward the flap, but Danner signaled for him to stop. The tapping continued. 3 beats, pause, then 2, Morse code. Hensley's mind raced, translating it automatically. It spelled one word: run. The men exchanged looks, fear overtaking discipline. Danner whispered, break camp, now. But as they moved, the radio came alive again, blasting that same word through static: run, over and over, louder each time. They bolted through the fog, packs half-sipped, rifles clutched tight. The sound followed them, first through the speakers, then through the trees. It echoed unnaturally, like the jungle itself was repeating it. The signal was everywhere, bouncing between the canopy, circling them. When they stopped to catch their breath, Hensley looked back. The antenna was still visible through the mist, glowing faintly, like it was alive. They didn't stop running until the signal faded completely, but even then, the static never left. Every time Hensley blinked, he could hear the faint hum, like the world around him was still tuned to that frequency. That night, while they rested in a new position, Hensley checked the radio again, against orders. The power light flickered, dim but steady, and when he put the headset on, he didn't hear static. He heard breathing. He called out for Danner, but before the sergeant could reach him, a voice whispered through the line, "You didn't run fast enough." The radio clicked off, leaving only silence. But from somewhere in the darkness, a second transmitter began to hum, one that none of them had set up. When they followed the sound, they found another camp, identical to theirs. Same tents, same layout, even a radio just like Hensley's. But the strangest part was what lay inside. The headsets were still warm, the rations still sealed, and on the cot, slumped over the radio, was Hensley. His body. The squad didn't speak. They just backed away, rifles trembling as the radio turned on by itself. The voice that came through this time wasn't Mason's or Danner's or even Hensley's. It was all of them, overlapping. Each soldier's voice layered into one horrific chorus: "We told you not to come here." Danner screamed for them to retreat, and they did, but the jungle shifted around them, trees twisting like silhouettes in fog. The frequency followed them wherever they went, bleeding into their equipment, their watches, even the hum of their own breath. No matter how far they ran, the sound was always there, faint, relentless, alive. That was the night the radio awoke, and from that night on, it never slept again. Even decades later, in the ruins of that forgotten jungle outpost, locals swear they can still hear it on stormy nights. The ghost frequency that speaks names no one remembers, calling out for soldiers who never made it home. The jungle swallowed their screams as the squad stumbled deeper into the unknown. Every rustle of the leaves sounded like footsteps behind them, every gust of wind like whispers chasing through the trees. Danner led the way with his flashlight shaking in his grip, its beams slicing through the fog in trembling arcs. They were trained soldiers, men who had fought through artillery and ambush. But this was different. This was something the manual didn't cover. Hours passed before they stopped to rest in a clearing where the moonlight barely touched the ground. Hensley sat apart, staring at the radio he had carried despite Danner's order to leave it behind. Its power light flickered faintly, though it wasn't connected to any battery. The others refused to look at it, pretending it wasn't there, pretending it wasn't humming, that same low, steady tone that now seemed to live inside their skulls. Private Ramos finally broke the silence. "What if we're already dead?" he whispered, eyes wide and wet. "Maybe that's why we heard them." Danner snapped at him to shut up, but the fear was contagious, spreading like wildfire through their nerves. No one wanted to admit that the idea made sense. The radio had spoken in voices of the dead before. Why wouldn't it call to the dead now? Then, from somewhere beyond the clearing, a sound rose, faint at first, like a breeze, then sharper, rhythmic. It was the distant crackle of another transmitter. Hensley's head jerked up. "That's the same frequency," he muttered, his voice barely a breath. Danner cursed and ordered everyone into formation. They followed the sound cautiously, rifles raised, stepping through mud and shadow. The closer they got, the louder the transmission grew. whispering, layered, alive. When they reached the source, they found another radio set, old, rusted, and half buried in the earth. Moss had grown over the dials, and its cord had snapped long ago. Yet it was on. The speaker emitted a faint signal, repeating something over and over. Hensley brushed away the dirt, his hands shaking as he turned the volume knob. The voice that came out was unmistakable. Danner's. Hold the line, don't let them in. The sergeant froze, staring at his own reflection in the cracked radio glass. He remembered saying those words years ago during a failed operation that wiped out his first squad. No one else had survived. He fell back a step, whispering, "That can't be possible." But the radio kept talking, replaying pieces of orders and screams from a battle no one should have recorded. The sound grew distorted, blending gunfire with voices, alive and dead, past and present. Suddenly, the voice changed. It was Mason again, calm and deliberate. "You've crossed the line, Danner. You're on our side now." The men turned to their sergeant, eyes wide, waiting for an order that never came. Danner's hands trembled. "Destroy it," he muttered. "Now." Hensley hesitated, but one of the others kicked the old transmitter into the dirt, smashing it to pieces. The forest went silent again. Too silent. Even the insects had stopped. Then, one by one, their own radios came to life. Every unit, even the ones turned off, began broadcasting the same faint sound. Morse code. Hensley scribbled on his notepad as he translated, his face draining of color. The message repeated endlessly. "We're not gone. You are." The squad panicked, slapping at their gear, trying to shut the devices down. But the code only grew louder, faster, desperate, until the sound merged into a continuous, piercing wail. The forest lights flickered. Flashes of movement between the trees, human shapes without form, shifting in and out of the mist. Hensley swore he saw Mason among them. Eyes hollow, mouth open as if speaking, but no sound came out. The others saw faces too, familiar ones, friends and enemies alike, all distorted, half-burned, or pale as ash. The echoes of the frequency weren't just sound anymore. They were taking shape. When the wailing stopped, they realized something else had changed. The air itself felt heavy, like the world had thickened. Their watches had stopped. Their compasses spun aimlessly, and even their breaths came in unsteady rhythm, like someone else was controlling it. The jungle wasn't just quiet, it was listening. Danner whispered for them to move, but every step they took echoed back twice, as if someone was walking right beside them. They reached a ridge overlooking the valley, or what used to be a valley. Now it was a crater, blackened and still smoking. The ground shimmered faintly, littered with fragments of metal and bones that had fused into the earth. In the center stood a single radio antenna, taller than a tree, humming like a living thing. The signal was strongest there. Danner felt it pulling at him, deep in his chest, like a heartbeat that wasn't his. Hensley started toward it, almost hypnotized. "That's where it's coming from," he murmured. Danner tried to stop him, but his voice came out wrong, delayed, echoing back in a deeper tone that wasn't his own. Hensley looked over his shoulder and froze. Danner's shadow on the ground was still, but Danner himself was moving. Something was wrong with their reflections. They weren't following. The antenna began to pulse. Every flash illuminated ghostly silhouettes in the crater, dozens of soldiers standing at attention, motionless. Their faces were blackened, their uniforms burned, but their eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the light like mirrors. The radio static rose to a deafening pitch, blending into screams that didn't sound human anymore. The ground trembled beneath their boots, and a wave of sound hit them like a blast. When it cleared, half the squad was gone. No bodies, no tracks, just empty rifles and helmets scattered across the ash. Hensley fell to his knees, clutching his ears, but the sound was still there. Inside his head now, whispering names he didn't know. Danner grabbed him by the collar and pulled him back, shouting over the invisible noise. "Don't listen. It feeds on that." But it was too late. Hensley's eyes rolled back, and his mouth moved in sync with the whispers, repeating them. The last thing they heard before running was their own voices coming through every frequency, alive, dead, overlapping, calling for help. Danner fired his weapon into the air, screaming at the jungle, at the sky, at whatever was listening. The echoes answered him, repeating every word in perfect time. "We're not gone," the voices said again, softer now, almost kind. "You are." As they fled through the forest, the static faded behind them, but the words didn't. They stayed, imprinted somewhere between their heartbeat and breath, a rhythm that would never stop. That night, as they collapsed miles away, Hensley swore he could still hear the transmission faintly, carried by the wind. The frequency wasn't bound to the jungle anymore. It was bound to them. Dawn broke in shades of ash and gray, yet the sun felt wrong, dim, like it was shining through smoke no one could see. The remaining soldiers huddled under a canopy of broken branches, their faces pale, eyes hollow. Danner sat apart, staring at his blood-streaked hands, trying to recall how many were left. He counted 6, then 5. When he looked again, one name slipped from memory entirely, as if that man had never existed. The radio they carried was silent now, wrapped in layers of cloth, but the silence itself was unbearable. It was too heavy, too deliberate, as though the air were waiting. Private Cole muttered prayers between shallow breaths, his dog tags clinking like chimes. Hensley stared into nothing, his lips moving soundlessly, as if he were speaking to someone unseen. Danner knew that look. He'd seen it before, on men who didn't come back from the edge of madness. By noon, the jungle had changed again. The path they'd followed last night was gone, erased by shifting trees and unfamiliar terrain. Every direction looked the same, yet somehow wrong. The trees leaned inward, their trunks forming a spiral around the camp. The sound of static was faint again. This time not from the radio, but from the air itself, like the world was breathing in fragments. Danner decided to move before nightfall. Staying meant dying. But as they packed their gear, Hensley spoke suddenly, not to anyone, but into his hands. "They're calling again," he said softly, almost peacefully. "They want to finish the message." Danner snapped, grabbing him by the collar. "You destroyed the signal, Private. You hear me? It's gone." But Hensley only smiled, eyes glassy, and whispered, "You can't destroy what remembers you." Then from somewhere deep in the forest, the radio answered with a single click. The transmitter wasn't connected to anything, yet the light blinked on. A voice came through, slow, mechanical, and warped. "Danner, this is command. Do you copy?" The sergeant froze. The voice was familiar, but layered beneath it was something else. A distorted echo repeating his own words. "Do you copy? Copy? Copy?" The phrase repeated endlessly, growing softer, like it was sinking beneath the static. Cole crossed himself. "That's not command," he whispered. Danner reached for the microphone, his hand trembling. "This is Sergeant Danner, Alpha Squad. Identify yourself." A pause followed, long, endless, before the reply came. "You've gone off-grid, Sergeant. Too far. We've been trying to reach you since the first war." The line crackled, and a chorus of overlapping voices bled through, some pleading, some screaming, some laughing, like broken records. Danner dropped the mic, staring in horror as his own voice joined them. The jungle began to hum, vibrating at the same pitch as the signal. The leaves shivered, though there was no wind, and the ground pulsed faintly underfoot. Cole shouted something, but it was lost in the rising noise. Danner watched as Hensley stood tall, arms raised toward the trees, his face illuminated by the faint blue glow of the radio light. "They're almost through," he said, his voice blending perfectly with the static, as if he were speaking both here and somewhere else. In the next moment, the sound exploded, a single sharp frequency that ripped through their heads like a scream. Every man fell to the ground, clutching his ears. When Danner opened his eyes, Hensley was gone. The only thing left where he'd stood was his headset smoking, the ear pads melted into the dirt. The radio was silent again. Then Danner realized the silence wasn't real. It was just the absence of everything that used to make sense. They moved on, following no map, guided only by instinct and fear. But no matter how far they went, the faint signal returned at dusk. This time the voice was clear and calm, and it wasn't Command or Hensley, it was Danner himself. "Hold your position," the voice said. "Help is on the way." The men froze. The voice spoke again, stronger now, issuing orders in Danner's tone, exact, precise, commanding. Dig in. Wait for nightfall. Private Cole fell to his knees, tears streaking his face. You're already broadcasting, he cried. Can't you hear yourself? Danner tried to deny it, but when he touched his throat, he felt the vibration, faint, rhythmic, perfectly synced with the radio's pulse. His mouth wasn't moving, but the words kept coming through the speaker. Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound. The others backed away slowly, their faces reflecting a terror deeper than the battlefield ever gave them. By night, the voice multiplied. It began giving orders that no soldier should hear. Lay down your rifles, remove your helmets, be still. The men refused, shouting over the sound. But the words grew louder, angrier, commanding obedience. Danner clutched the mic, trying to override it, shouting, "This is not an order. That's not me." But the frequency didn't care. It just laughed. A metallic, grinding sound that echoed his voice perfectly. Cole fired a round into the radio, shattering its casing. Sparks flew, but the voice continued from the broken speaker, now faint and distorted. Orders are orders, Sergeant. The squad fell into chaos, running in every direction, tripping through the underbrush as if the forest itself wanted to trap them. Danner stumbled after them, shouting their names, but each name came back to him seconds later, whispered by a voice that wasn't human. By morning, he was alone. The jungle had swallowed his men without a trace. The radio remained on the ground, split open but still glowing faintly, wires twitching like veins. He knelt beside it, exhausted, staring into the flickering light. For the first time, he didn't hear static. He heard breathing. Hundreds of shallow breaths, all in unison, all waiting. Then a single voice emerged, soft and familiar. "You can rest now, Sergeant. We'll take it from here." Danner didn't answer. His body trembled as he lifted the mic to his lips, knowing the truth at last. He wasn't receiving orders. He was the broadcast. His voice had become part of the signal, trapped in an endless loop of command and response, echoing through frequencies no one alive could reach. With his final breath, he whispered into the mic, "This is Sergeant Danner, signing off." The radio pulsed once, and the jungle fell silent. Decades later, scavengers found the remains of that transmission post, buried beneath vines and ash. They recovered the radio, cleaned it, restored it. When they turned it on, the speaker hissed, then a voice spoke, clear, steady, and alive. "This is Sergeant Danner. Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound." And in the distance, deep within the static, the jungle whispered back, "Copy that." The map was torn, mud-soaked, and nearly useless. But the numbers were clear. They had appeared on the radio's cracked display, flickering like a heartbeat before the device finally died for good. Private Cole wrote them down with shaking hands, unsure why. Coordinates. They didn't match anything on their charts, but the signal had pulsed one last time as if demanding they follow. And for reasons none of them could explain, they obeyed. The surviving soldiers, just Cole, Mercer, and Alvarez, moved through terrain that didn't exist on any map. The compass needles spun constantly, their watches ticked backward, and the air grew thicker with every step. The jungle changed around them, trees bending in unfamiliar patterns, the smell of decay following like a shadow. Each time they tried to turn back, the ground seemed to fold in on itself, redirecting them toward the same invisible point. By nightfall, they reached a clearing unlike any they had seen. The moon hung unnaturally low, lighting the ground in a cold silver glow. In the center stood something metallic, not a bunker, not a vehicle, but a tall, rusted tower half swallowed by the earth. At its base were symbols scratched into the dirt, crude and circular, surrounding what looked like broken radio parts. The coordinates had led them here, to this forgotten scar in the world. Cole stepped closer, his breath misting in the humid air. "This can't be ours," he murmured. The structure was too old, its design too alien for any army installation. Yet it pulsed faintly, emitting a sound like a heartbeat through static. Alvarez swore he heard whispers rising from the metal, not from speakers, but from inside the steel itself. Each whisper sounded like a voice pleading to be heard. They found a hatch buried beneath vines. It took both Mercer and Alvarez to pry it open, the hinges screaming as dust and darkness spilled out. Inside was a narrow staircase spiraling downward into the ground. The air that rose from it was stale and electric, like ozone after lightning. Against reason, they descended. Every step made the walls hum, faint lights flickering as though their movement awakened something long dormant. At the bottom, they found a chamber lined with shattered glass and rusted consoles. Old radios stacked in rows, still connected by tangled wires. In the center sat a chair, not military issue, but something older, fused with cables that seemed to grow from the floor itself. On the seat lay a headset, intact and humming softly. A small green light blinked in the darkness, steady and patient. Cole hesitated, staring at it. The hum matched his heartbeat perfectly. "Don't touch it," Mercer warned, his voice trembling. But something about the light drew Cole closer. The console nearest the chair flickered to life, displaying the same numbers as before, the coordinates. Then they shifted, one digit at a time, until they formed a new sequence. Mercer gasped. It was their current position. "Whatever this place is," Alvarez muttered, "it's listening to us." Before anyone could respond, the speakers around the room crackled, static filled the air. Then a voice, not distant this time, but immediate, inside the room. "Sergeant Danner, do you copy?" The men froze. The sound wasn't coming from any radio. It came from the walls themselves. The metal vibrated with each word like a heartbeat echoing through the structure. Console stepped back, shaking his head. No, he's gone." He signed off. But the voice continued, ignoring him. "Coordinates verified, reinforcements inbound." Then came a sound, faint, rhythmic footsteps descending the staircase they had used. 3 sets of boots turned toward the tunnel in perfect silence. The footsteps grew louder, deliberate, metallic. Whoever or whatever was coming wasn't human. Alvarez raised his rifle, aiming at the stairwell. "Show yourself," he yelled, his voice cracking. The echo repeated his command. "Show yourself," but it didn't sound like him. It was slower, hollow, mismatched in timing. The steps stopped just before the final turn, and a single shadow stretched across the wall. It looked like a soldier, but its movements twitched in fragments as though reality struggled to hold it in place. Then the voice changed again, deeper, distorted beyond recognition. "You shouldn't have followed the coordinates." The lights flickered violently. Cole's head pounded as if the frequency itself was tearing through his skull. The shadow moved, stepping into the chamber's faint glow. What stood before them wore a uniform like theirs. But its face was wrong, features blurred, eyes burning white like static-made flesh. The thing tilted its head, radio wires pulsing along its neck. It raised a broken transmitter in one hand, the same kind Danner had used, and spoke through it, though no sound left its mouth. The chamber filled with noise, thousands of voices overlapping in agony. "You heard the call," they said. "Now you are part of it." The lights exploded, plunging the room into darkness. Gunfire erupted, the echoes drowned in static. When the lights flickered back, only Cole remained. His ears bleeding, his rifle empty. The chamber was still. The tower above them groaned, vibrating like a living organism waking from a long sleep. Then the console blinked again, displaying one final set of coordinates, this time labeled Origin. Cole stumbled toward the screen, dizzy, trying to focus. The numbers didn't make sense. They pointed to a place that shouldn't exist, in the middle of the ocean, thousands of miles away, a place no map had ever marked. As he stared, a faint signal began to play through the remaining speaker. It was Danner's voice again, calm, measured, and inhumanly steady. "Hold your position, soldier. You've reached the beginning." Cole dropped to his knees, clutching his head as the sound grew louder. The air shimmered, bending the light around him until the room began to dissolve. The tower's hum deepened, pulling everything inward. The wires, the consoles, even the air itself collapsing toward the glowing coordinates. Cole screamed as the static swallowed him whole. When the tower finally went silent, the jungle above returned to stillness. The fog lifted, the wind sighed, and the clearing stood empty, except for a half-buried transmitter, still broadcasting a single tone. Days later, a patrol team picked it up. The device displayed only one message on repeat, glowing faintly through the dirt, signal origin located. And beneath it, a new set of coordinates slowly appeared, leading straight back to where they stood. 30 years had passed before anyone set foot in that jungle again. The war was long over, and the stories about missing patrols and phantom broadcasts had faded into myth. But the military never stopped listening. Somewhere deep beneath classified frequencies, the old signal still whispered, faint, rhythmic, like a ghost breathing through static. When the pulse suddenly spiked after decades of silence, Command assembled a retrieval unit. Their mission was simple: locate the source and shut it down. The 6-man team arrived by helicopter at dawn. Captain Reese led them, a hardened veteran with a scar that looked like lightning down his jaw. They were armed with modern tech, satellite uplinks, and digital radios. But the moment they crossed into the forest, every piece of equipment began to fail. Compasses spun, GPS units rebooted, and the air filled with a low electrical hum. Reese shrugged it off as interference, but his second-in-command, Torres, noticed something stranger. The hum had a rhythm, like Morse code. By nightfall, they reached the clearing. The jungle had reclaimed almost everything, but the steel towers still jutted through the trees like a bone-piercing skin. The metal was rusted black, yet faint pulses of light flickered inside the seams. The men circled it cautiously, scanning for power sources, but there were none. The signal was coming from underground. Reese ordered them to find the entrance, and within minutes, they uncovered a corroded hatch buried beneath the roots. The first man down was Corporal Dane, carrying a floodlight and sensor array. The air inside smelled burnt, metallic, ancient. No movement, he called up. "But, sir, this place is alive." His voice cracked as the light caught the walls, covered in cables that pulsed like veins. The deeper they descended, the louder the hum became, resolving into the faint outline of a voice repeating the same coordinates. Reese descended next, his radio flickering with ghostly echoes. At the bottom lay the chamber, still intact, though the consoles had grown into the stone like coral. A single green light blinked in the dark, steady and defiant. "There's our transmitter," Reese said. Torres approached it, brushing off layers of dust, but when she touched the panel, the light flared to life, flooding the room in sickly green. The static sharpened, forming syllables that sent chills through them all. "Welcome back," it said. The team froze. "Who's transmitting?" Reese demanded. His voice steady, though his hands weren't. The speaker answered in perfect clarity. "Captain Reese, Bravo Recon, serial number 44, 192. Mission active." Reese's blood ran cold. That was his file number, one he'd never spoken aloud. "How the hell," he began, but the voice interrupted, identical to his own tone. "Proceed to secure the objective. Reinforcements inbound." The room vibrated violently as every console powered on at once. Data flashed across dead screens, names, dates, coordinates, all from missions that had ended in failure or disappearance. Torres stepped closer and gasped. These are all us." The screens listed their unit, their photos, even timestamps of the current minute. One by one, their heart rate monitors spiked, syncing perfectly with the rhythm of the signal. Then the lights dimmed, leaving only the glow of the main console. The voice shifted, layering multiple tones until it sounded inhuman. "They always come back," it said. "The signal remembers every soul it takes." Reese shouted for evacuation, but their radios screamed back with distorted versions of their own voices. "Negative, Captain. You're already inside." Static drowned the rest, but the message was clear. They were trapped inside the broadcast. Torres pulled a flash drive from her pack, desperate to capture data for proof. As she connected it, the console displayed an image, not data but a live feed. The camera panned through the bunker, showing them standing exactly where they were. But then, one by one, each figure began to vanish from the feed, dissolving into static until only Torres remained. The screen flashed red. "Transmission complete." Dane screamed. The walls began to move, slow, deliberate creaks like the metal was breathing. "It's closing in," someone shouted. The cables snaked across the floor, wrapping around boots, climbing legs. Reese fired his rifle, bullets sparking harmlessly off steel. The tower above them responded with a deep, thunderous pulse that sent dust raining from the ceiling. Torres severed the cables with her knife, shouting for them to retreat. They sprinted for the stairwell, the hum now deafening, resonating inside their skulls. As Reese climbed, he felt the steps vibrate beneath his hands, each rung glowing faintly as he touched it. Behind him, the chamber erupted in light, a blinding green explosion that filled the tunnel with searing static. When they burst through the hatch, the jungle was gone. In its place stretched endless fog, and the faint outline of the tower multiplied, dozens of them, stretching into infinity. The team staggered backward, disoriented. "This isn't where we landed," Dane whispered. Their comms crackled. "Command to recon. Status check." Reese grabbed the mic, relief washing over him. "This is Captain Reese, we made it out." The voice on the other end interrupted. "Negative, Captain. You've been off-grid for 30 years. Reese froze. The voice continued calmly. "We received your final broadcast this morning." Torres's eyes widened. "Final broadcast," she murmured. Reese looked down. The radio in his hand wasn't transmitting, it was playing. The speaker repeated his own voice, word for word from seconds earlier. "This is Captain Reese. We made it out." The recording looped, overlapping itself until it formed a chorus of his voice. And then beneath it came another. Deeper, older, whispering, "Welcome to the signal." Lightning cracked overhead. Every tower flickered alive, each one broadcasting the same repeating phrase across frequencies worldwide. The men fell to their knees, clutching their heads as the sound filled the air. A transmission not of words but of memories, screams, and the echo of endless commands. Somewhere inside the static, Danner's voice returned, calm and eternal. "Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound." When the noise finally stopped, only the bunker remained, silent, patient, still transmitting. Satellite scans later detected it, broadcasting on every frequency simultaneously, though no source could be pinpointed. Inside, a single console still glowed with fresh data. On its screen, 6 new names scrolled into view, the retrieval units, and below them, a final line appeared in bold, blinking text: "Next signal locked." The signal didn't stop at the jungle. Within hours of the retrieval team's disappearance, the transmission leaked beyond military channels, bleeding into civilian frequencies across continents. Amateur radio operators reported strange interference, whispers beneath the static, voices repeating numbers in perfect rhythm. At first, governments blamed atmospheric distortion, but soon too many listeners claimed the same thing. The voices were saying their names. In a basement in Ohio, a retired operator named Walter Klein picked up the signal while scanning for a storm broadcast. The frequency came through clean, unusually strong for a shortwave channel. He leaned closer, frowning as he recognized his own name. Whispered 3 times, followed by a phrase that chilled his blood. "Do you copy?" He tried to shut the receiver off, but it wouldn't power down. The signal hissed, then laughed, softly, like static breathing. Half a world away, in a Tokyo control tower, an air traffic controller heard the same frequency burst through his headset. The voice spoke flawless Japanese, calm and monotone, identifying itself as a pilot who had died in an air crash decades earlier. "Tower, confirm my landing," it said. "I have the coordinates." The controller froze. The coordinates weren't in Japan. They pointed to a patch of jungle in South America that no one had flown over since 1973. By morning, the phenomenon spread to naval channels, weather bands, and encrypted satellite relays. Every signal carried a single repeating phrase buried deep beneath the noise: "Hold your position." Engineers tried filtering the frequency out, but it always returned, adjusting to new wavelengths as though it were learning. Experts claimed it was a rogue AI. Linguists called it a mass hallucination. But the soldiers who'd served in that war knew better. They recognized the voice of Sergeant Danner. Inside a bunker in Virginia, Major Collins reviewed the intercepted data. "This isn't a transmission," he muttered. "It's an infection." The waveform displayed unnatural symmetry, pulsing like a heartbeat. Each pulse contained fragments of human speech, names, ranks, memories. The strangest part was that some of the voices belonged to soldiers declared MIA more than 30 years ago. The machine wasn't just speaking, it was remembering. Across the ocean, a team of scientists tried to isolate the signal. They played it on loop in a soundproof chamber, feeding it through analog equipment to observe distortion patterns. At 0300 hours, the experiment failed catastrophically. Every monitor displayed a single word, "Listen." The recording engineer collapsed, clutching his ears. When he regained consciousness, he repeated the word endlessly, as if the signal had written itself into his mind. Meanwhile, civilians began reporting dreams of radios that wouldn't turn off, glowing softly beside their beds, whispering in voices that alternated between loved ones and strangers. Some woke to find their phones tuned to frequencies they couldn't access. Others claimed they heard the sound through walls, plumbing, even their own heartbeat. Psychologists dismissed it as paranoia, but the dreams always ended the same way, with their names being called. In one rural town, every emergency siren activated simultaneously at 2:17 a.m. Residents rushed outside, expecting tornadoes or fire. Instead, the speakers emitted a slow, rhythmic hum. Then through the night air, the voice began to speak. Clear, calm, and chillingly familiar. "This is Captain Reese," it said, "Reinforcements inbound." The sirens fell silent after 7 seconds, but every clock in town stopped at the same moment. The military moved to contain the outbreak of transmissions, jamming airwaves and quarantining equipment, but jammers only amplified the sound, creating feedback loops that grew stronger the more they resisted. Satellites in orbit began picking up faint echoes, not from Earth, but from somewhere beyond it. The signal was bouncing off nothing, yet returning stronger each time, like a voice finding its way home. Major Collins ordered a full blackout. "No one transmits," he commanded. "No one answers." But that night, the base radios turned on by themselves. Each unit's display showed the same list of names. Every soldier currently on duty. Then one by one, the names vanished from the list as if being erased. The final name to disappear was Collins. The next morning, his chair sat empty, headset still humming. Outside, communication towers across the globe began flickering with energy. Lights danced along their spires, blinking in a perfect sequence. Morse code spelling out coordinates. Analysts tracked the message and froze. The numbers led to nowhere again, a blank zone in the middle of the ocean where the original tower had been thought destroyed. The signal wasn't random anymore. It was calling the world back to where it began. People who listened too long started to change. First came the migraines, then nosebleeds, and finally the whispers, faint at first, then constant. They spoke in rhythm with the listener's heartbeat, urging them to go to the coordinates. Whole ships vanished, following the call, their last transmissions filled with pleading voices saying, "We're almost there." The Navy banned all unsupervised radio use, but that didn't stop the sound from spreading. One by one, civilian frequencies began to align with the same pulse. Radio DJs joked about it on air until one night, mid-broadcast, a host froze mid-sentence. His co-anchor asked if he was okay. He turned slowly, smiled faintly, and whispered into the microphone, "They're saying my name." Then he began repeating it, over and over, until his voice blended perfectly with the static. By the end of the week, the signal had become part of everyday noise, hidden in white noise, traffic reports, even television static. But those who knew how to listen could still hear the truth beneath it. A layered chorus made of thousands of overlapping voices, whispering in harmony. "Hold your position, reinforcements inbound," and somewhere beneath the ocean, far below the static, a faint green light flickered to life once more. It pulsed steadily, once every 3 seconds, as if keeping time with the heartbeat of the world. Then faintly through the deep came a whisper that no human could have sent. It wasn't in English or any language known to man, but every listener understood it perfectly. "We're not done yet," or "Gorgon me." By the time the world realized it couldn't silence the signal, it was already everywhere. It wasn't just in radios anymore. It was in the hum of electricity, the rhythm of engines, the pulse beneath the ground. Cities began to experience blackouts that weren't caused by power failure, but by interference so strong it made lights flicker in patterns that spelled words. People started to understand those patterns instinctively, even without realizing they were reading them. In laboratories, scientists traced the waveform and discovered something horrifying. The frequency wasn't just sound, it was structure. It was rebuilding itself through anything that carried current. Every time someone tried to shut it down, it grew stronger, feeding on the energy used to fight it. It's self-replicating, one researcher muttered before every monitor in the room lit up with the words, "Do not resist." Satellite arrays caught the first visual distortion weeks later, a faint shimmer across the ocean where the original coordinates lay. The water pulsed with faint green light, visible even from orbit. Naval drones sent to investigate lost contact seconds before arrival, but one brief image transmitted back a massive metallic structure beneath the waves, covered in veins of light, pulsing like a living heart. The world now knew the signal had a body. As governments panicked, religious groups claimed prophecy. They said the voices were the dead, building a bridge between the living and the beyond. But soldiers who'd heard it firsthand disagreed. The signal didn't sound like salvation. It sounded like orders. And as one general whispered to his aide before vanishing mid-briefing, "It's not calling us to heaven, it's calling us back to war." Within months, the signal became part of the planet's natural background noise. It existed everywhere, in storm clouds, in deep-sea currents, even in the hum of blood through human veins. Doctors reported patients hearing rhythmic whispers inside their own heartbeat. Every monitor showed identical brainwave patterns, synchronized perfectly to the same invisible frequency. Humanity was beginning to resonate. The media stopped broadcasting altogether. Television static carried faces now, flickering, fragmented images of soldiers standing in formation, staring through the screen as if waiting for orders. One night, every channel across every country showed the same frame: Sergeant Danner, uniform immaculate, face blank. He raised a radio to his mouth and spoke 3 words that echoed across the world: "Stand by, soldiers." Seismographs recorded tremors that didn't come from the Earth's crust, but from the sky. The signal was altering the atmosphere, bending radio waves into physical form. Northern lights began to appear in regions that had never seen them. Glowing a sickly green, pilots reported shapes moving inside the clouds. Rows of figures marching silently, illuminated only by lightning. They vanished as suddenly as they came, leaving the smell of ozone and ash. Deep-sea sensors detected movement near the coordinates. Massive metal structures rose slowly from the ocean floor. Towers identical to the one found in the jungle, now glowing brighter than ever. They connected through unseen frequencies, aligning perfectly across the globe. From above, satellites captured the terrifying pattern they formed, a circle surrounding the planet, pulsing in time with Earth's magnetic field. The first cities to fall were the ones closest to those towers. Radios screamed endlessly, and the people within them began to vanish, leaving behind only faint echoes, electromagnetic imprints of their last moments. Surveillance footage showed them dissolving into light, their outlines flickering as they whispered, "Copy that." Governments tried to bomb the structures, but missiles veered off course as if something invisible bent their path. One scientist, Dr. Marek, discovered a chilling truth hidden in the signal's pattern. It wasn't random at all. It was counting down. Every pulse was a marker, decreasing in frequency as though approaching zero. "When it stops," he said to a colleague, "it won't be silence. It'll be transmission complete." Hours later, his lab was found empty, the walls lined with hand-scribbled numbers, the same countdown repeating endlessly. In isolated places, survivors began to hear their own names again, whispered by the wind, spoken through broken radios, carved into walls by unseen hands. The signal didn't need machines anymore. It had imprinted itself on existence. Every vibration, every heartbeat, every echo carried its message. It no longer asked if anyone could copy. It already knew. Then one night, all sounds ceased. The world went silent. No wind, no waves, no hum of power. For exactly 60 seconds, absolute quiet reigned. When the first sound returned, it wasn't thunder or machinery, it was a single voice. Calm, commanding, and unmistakable. "This is Sergeant Danner," it said. "All units, stand by for final transmission." Across the globe, lights flickered in unison. Screens came alive, showing one symbol, a rotating circle made of concentric lines, the pulse of the signal itself. As the voice continued, people began to vanish again, not in terror but in obedience. Their faces serene, eyes glowing faintly green. They weren't being destroyed, they were being recruited. The world was joining the frequency. When the countdown reached 0, the towers stopped pulsing. The ocean grew still. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the world had returned to peace. But deep in the static, a whisper remained, soft yet eternal, a frequency now built into the foundation of reality. It no longer needed transmitters, soldiers, or machines. It had become the world's heartbeat. And if you listen closely, in the hum of a dead radio, the buzz of power lines, or the silence before a storm, you can still hear it. A voice from nowhere, calm and endless, repeating the same words its sips spoken since that first night in the jungle. "Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound." They say war leaves echoes, memories carved into earth, smoke, and bone. But some echoes don't fade. Some learn to speak back. Decades after the last soldier vanished and the final radio fell silent, that signal still drifts across the airwaves, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to answer. No one knows where it began or what it became. Some call it a curse, others a warning. But those who've heard it all agree on one thing. Once it calls your name, you're already part of it. Maybe the transmission was never about reaching command. Maybe it wasn't even human at all. Maybe it was the war itself, learning to speak, learning to recruit, learning to live. So if one night your radio hums to life on its own, if you hear a voice whisper through the static saying your name and offering coordinates you don't recognize, don't answer, don't listen. Because the signal doesn't die, it waits. And somewhere through the static of a forgotten frequency, it sits still saying the same words it always did. "Hold your position. Reinforcements inbound."